Alhamdulillah wa kafa wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da wa ba'd. Alhamdulillah, we've come so far because today we're looking at the interim period after the demise of the Abbasid governance, the Seljuks, and the rise of the Ottomans. We're looking at a time period of 662 to 762. The interim period, the Seljuks and the rise of the Ottomans, is from 656 to 699, that particular area. But we're going to go further because obviously we're covering a century at a time. We need to keep a short recap of what's happened so far with regard to the governance. We ended on a low point the last session because we had the judiciary exterminated and the Khulafa, figureheads that they were, some of them being oppressive as they were, exterminated. Baghdad destroyed, the river Euphrates running black for 9 months with the ink of all the books thrown into it. Let me say as a beginning point, there were scholars who split into two camps regarding the devastation that happened. There were those who stayed behind and fought the Tatars until they died. They just fought them. With everything they had, they fought the Tatars. Fought until they died. Some, in the aftermath of the devastation, when they saw that the books and the knowledge were being annihilated, memorized heavily and took whatever written material was left over and came to Damascus. If you look at the amount of written literature that was destroyed and what was taken to Damascus, you will find that 85% of the knowledge was kept and restored from Baghdad to Damascus, just in the heads and hearts of people. The remaining 15% was quoted in other commentary literature by those scholars. So although we may have lost those books in their physical form, they weren't lost completely because they're quoted in other works and commentaries. So the ulama, again, saved the knowledge. Through their memory, saved the knowledge. You have books, for example, during one of the massacres of the Franks, or the Franj in Andalus, Taj al-Urus was one of the works that came under attack. And so what happened is one of the ulama took Taj al-Urus and was flipping through it and memorized it by the time the rest of Andalus fell. Took it to Iraq and recited it from memory and had it written down. There were very few mistakes other than diacritical markings, like instead of duriba, daraba, and things like this. But it was by and large preserved because, again, the ulama protected this religion. And I cannot stress it enough to you that the people that have been in charge of this religion, as the Prophet ﷺ said, the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. They protected this religion by their memory, by their sacrifice, and their dying. Now, from the years 656 to 660 AH, after the slaughter of the Abbasid rulers by the Mongols, or the Tatars is their more common historical name because there were a particular brand of them called Tatars. There were no Khalifahs, Abbasid or otherwise. There was no Khilafah. From 656 to 660, there was no Khilafah. I want this point mainly mentioned because we have some groups in our midst that insist that there either has always been this unbroken Khilafah in our midst and that it's fardh on every Muslim to work for it, and that it's a big sin if it's left for just a second. Think carefully. The ulama are the inheritors of the prophets, the safeguard of this ummah. do we really believe if it was fard ayn on the whole ummah to have khilafah that it would have been left for 4 years? What's important, Surah Ash-Shura, the 42nd Surah, Ayah 13, Aqimud Deen, establish the deen. Establishing the Sharia is a mainstay. As for khilafah or imara or the different means of implementing it, that's a different matter altogether. And the khilafah, as we've spoken on already, is the sole providence of the ulama to establish. So for 4 years there was no khilafah. What were the ulama doing? Fighting in wars against the Tatars, calling people to make tawbah, fighting against other forces and enemies. That's what they were doing. And governing the ummah as they had been before. What difference was there to the ulama for these figureheads that are now gone as opposed to when they're there? Nothing. Is the zakah still being established? Yes. Jum'ahs are still happening? Yes. Armies are still being dispatched? Of course. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is the general makeup of how the top-down government worked, with a righteous Khalifa in charge, in which that person was a scholar or taking from the scholars. There would be a go-between. But with that, the ulama picked up the rest of the slack in the absence of the Khalifa and his deputies. And they continued to distribute zakah and do everything else as they had been normally. What remained of the earthly rulers were amirs, walis, sultans who had their armies, governors, and trucial states. The bay'ah of the people and loyalty still resided with the scholars as per the time of the Qadi Abu Ya'la the Elder. With the vicious murder of Imam Yahya al-Sarsari, the judiciary was devastated. The scholars that stayed and fought, some were martyred, while others lived to take away some of the knowledge to the next closest center of influence, Damascus, which is in the country of Sham. As of 660 AH, the Abbasids were back in power, but in Egypt, and they were only figureheads. Now this part is also important. So the Abbasids, if we remembered before, when they defeated and crushed the Fatimiyya, what did Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi did? He interrupted the Fatimi khutbah, came in, interrupted the majlis, interrupted the khutbah, actually took the imam down from the mimbar, and then completely revamped Al-Azhar. So Al-Azhar, which was originally built as a Shia, Ismaili as well as Ithna Ashari institution, was made Sunni only 900 years ago, 800 years ago. It has not been Sunni that long. And now it's headed back towards that Shia direction because they've gained a lot of control over the faculty. Now, in looking at this situation, Damascus became the next center. Originally, when Baghdad was known as Qubbatul Islam, the Dome of Islam, or Madinatul Salam, the city of peace, people would have after the name Al-Baghdadi, Al-Iraqi. That's how you could tell people were proud to have that because they'd either lived there or they were from there. Now there's a shift in which now you start to see after people's name Al-Dimashqi, Al-Ba'labaki, Al-Ba'ali, right? Al-Beiruti, right? From Beirut, from Ba'labak al-Ba'ali. Al-Dimashqi, from Damascus. Al-Dumani, from Duma. They start to have Al-Ruhaybani, from Ruhayba. They start to have these titles that now, because the balance of culture had shifted to Sham, and then to a lesser extent to Egypt, in which people now had Al-Masri or Al-Misri, people say it different ways. They had this now after their names. So you had major Maliki ulama from North Africa bearing Al-Misri after their name. Major Hanafi scholars bearing Al-Misri. In fact, that became the seat of Hanafi learning. Many of the major scholars that are the backbone of the Hanafi school in terms of authoritative fatwa, like Ibn Abidin, are either Shamis or they're Egyptians. Badruddin al-Aini is an Egyptian. Qutlubagha is an Egyptian. All these different figures were either Egyptians or Shamis in the recent history because of the level of knowledge and the endeavors that they put into it, the commentary literature. The Hanafi school matured to a deeper level in Egypt and in Sham. And that's why when you look at, if you look at the curriculum between, say, Pakistan and India, and their studies and the studies of, say, the 16 and 1500s in Sham and Egypt, there's a marked difference, not because one's inferior, but just because of the emphasis upon the learning of the knowledge and perfecting of it. There were different means that the Hanafis that were Arabs had to the Hanafis that were coming from India and Pakistan. And the Central Asians, if we're talking Afghanistan over into the Central Asian republics, they had an edge over everyone because they memorized everything. So you had a Muslim brother, and I'd mentioned this I think before, who was a dear colleague of mine. He came here from Afghanistan, and he was surprised that adults here and in some other institutions were studying Nur al-Idah. He said, because we memorized that book when we were in elementary education. We memorized that. In Jalalabad and Herat, we memorized that book. He says, so I find it very strange that adults are, poring over this book and putting so much of their time and energy into it. We memorized this, and we memorized these other books. He says, it's so strange to us. That shows the emphasis that they have on knowledge. And again, it goes way back to Imam Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, who preserved the madhab, Abu Hafs al-Nasafi, who's another Central Asian Hanafi, Samarqandis, these type of people. You cannot get around the Hanafi school. You cannot study it in any real depth without dealing with the ulama of Samarkand or Central Asia and Afghanistan. You have to deal with those ulama. You just can't get around it. You must deal with those ulama. And that's one of the reasons why. Now in 659, in the month of Muharram, the Mamluks of Egypt, which included Baibars, Qutuz, and Qalawun, moved against the Tatars with great fury and defeated them at the Battle of Ain Jalut, a location in Sham in which only one Muslim died. Now this Battle of Ain Jalut, the Muslims were outnumbered by, some historical accounts say 10, some say 30 to 1 odds. The Mongols or the Tatars were undefeated so far. They'd rolled over every civilization that they'd ever encountered. They came down from the Central Asian steppes and they killed 42 million Chinese people in 10 years. I'll say that again. They killed 42 million Chinese people in 10 years. The Chinese returned the favor to the Muslims from 39 to 49 by killing 40 million of us, which still isn't covered in any archives, and they don't talk about it. Inshallah, we will. But they killed 42 million Muslims, 42 million Chinese, coming down from the Central Asian steppes. Then they moved further, and the army passed by Afghanistan. It didn't go fully into Afghanistan. It passed by. They passed by Vietnam and Cambodia and thought that there was no one living there because they had tunneled under their country and were preparing for trench warfare with the Mongols, which the Mongols didn't know about and passed by. That same warfare would be used in the Vietnam War against the Americans. And so the Vietnamese and Cambodians were very adept at using extraordinary tactics to win wars. The Cham Muslim Empire at that time, which was in Cambodia and Cham, they were called Cham or Sham Muslims. They were the Malays that had paddled over from Malaysia and Indonesia into Cambodia and Vietnam and built a small sultana in that area, mostly Shafi'is. They're Shafi'is in fiqh. They were affected by the Mongols, but only slightly. The Mongols rolled over Baghdad, as we obviously covered, and they rolled over areas in the former empire of Iran. So everywhere they went, the people either hid, they were rolled over and incorporated, or devastated. As a quick explanation, the Tatars, their religion was shamanism, which is the belief in ancestor and spirit worship. Festivals tend to center around the worship of ancestors. If anyone's ever seen, an example of shamanism would be if you've ever seen the Japanese festival of Obun, where they leave food out for their ancestors once a year. And they come and they worship their ancestors and ask them to forgive them and to bring them good luck. This is shamanism. That is the very essence of shamanism. It's different to animism slightly, but that is shamanism.